I'd like to ask two questions, one which is more conceptual and one which is specific in response to a question from Ian Chorlton. Ian, good to see you. And also actually an anonymous attendee. So first of all so basically speaking, how can you, because all of you are associated with local policing, Thomas in New York, Roy, London, your Metropolitan Police. That's how you identify as Uttar Pradesh. You identify yourself as a New York policeman. But as you said, it is non-boundary, non-jurisdictional, isn't it? I mean, you know, it is global and universal. Roy, I think we have 43 police forces in the UK. You, of course, in India have statewide. Thomas, I mean, you know what? I've studied the damn thing. I still don't understand how American policing works. There are so many different, I mean, sort of structures and overlaying jurisdictions. Is that, because of course, complexity is both the advantage, but also a disadvantage. If I can come to you, Thomas, the complexity of what we would call in the UK interoperability, the ability to sort of create integrated programs with multiple stakeholders. Is that a challenge that you are facing today? And then I will add on to that, what is your interaction with the private sector? Because of course the private sector has, I imagine that the private sector holds expertise, which would be very valuable to you. I mean, for example, mobile phone data, for example, internet activity, for example. So we are trying to be good men in a complex world, aren't we? Or good people in a complex world. How does that affect you, and sort of what are the impacts it has on you in your policing role?
Okay, one thing, if you don't mind, I'd just like to go back for a second, because we did talk about a little bit about the militarization of the police department. And I think that's something that we see as a result of, 9/11 and terrorism. And it's just evolved since that time. I mean, following 9/11, the department had to have a more aggressive stand. And then, we started to put out on the streets, teams with heavy weapons that could respond very quickly to things, very military looking. Many of the officers that have been hired over the last 20 years are people also that served in the military, and they bring home these military types ideas, as well as military surplus from the government given to police departments. So, we've stood up this military type of footing because of terrorism. And, we could talk about, international extremist terrorism, or even our homegrown, not homegrown, but, our racially and ethnically motivated, or what people would like to call domestic terrorists here, with these massive shootouts that we have. And the public's gotten very used to seeing, a military type of a police force. However, when we move into an area now that we have so many protests, and you're starting to see the protests and people that look like military, it becomes a big conflict. And that is a problem that I think we're seeing now. And I think we're seeing calls to, remove a lot of this military equipment that's been given to police departments. Now, here in New York City, we don't use some of the devices that are used in other parts of the country, whether it's a different kind of gas or rubber bullets and so on. We are a larger department, so we try and throw resources at it rather than actually, using tear gas and so on. But that's being used commonly throughout the country. So, that becomes a bit of a problem. And I think, people would have never thought that you would see people with heavy weapons outside the Eiffel Tower, or, in London, that, bobbies that didn't carry a gun. And now you have teams that are carrying weapons because of the threat that we are seeing, from both the right and the left, and religious type of extremism. So that's something that, we're dealing with. One other thing that Roy mentioned was about communities. And Roy, I agree with you. We have 77 separate precincts in New York City, and that gives the community the ability to really locally, get to know who their precinct commander is and those precinct officers. And in each one of those precincts, we have neighborhood coordination officers that is supposed to work very closely with the community. And we try and do it at a local level. So we're pushing that down to lower ranking officers, police officers and detectives, to set up meetings, not in the precinct, but to go out to the communities and community centers and have meetings with everybody. Technology plays into that, because we've given every officer a mobile digital phone. That phone can be used for, police services, as far as, running people, running plates, and all those abilities that you would get at a computer in a precinct. but it also gives you an email address and a phone number that we send out to our community. And our community knows the neighborhood coordination officer can reach out to them directly, either by email or phone. So we're trying to connect with them. Even in our transit, we have transit districts. Those are in addition to the 77 precincts. We try to have the same officers on the same tours during rush hour. So when people come down into the subway, they're going to see the same person, and we encourage them to engage with those people that are going to work, to try and give them some sense of that, okay, this is my post, I'm here for you every morning, and try and engage. And, it's so that, to build the trust with the community. Budget cuts are hurting us like it's hurting everywhere. Our force has lost 4,000 people probably in the last 4 months, and we're at the lowest strength that we've had since I think 1995. So that's gonna hurt us a little bit.
Thomas, can I ask you why that is? Just briefly, I mean, at a time of so much pressure, why now are you losing 4,000 officers?
So one of the things that happened was, as a result of the George Floyd protests, is that our city council decided to, and the calls throughout the country to defund the police. And we were hit extremely hard. We lost $1 billion in our budget, which prevented us from doing 3 classes right now. At the same time, our officers that had eligibility to retire, many of them, I would have to say that, there was a time during this where morale was going down a little bit, and I think people decided that this might be the time for them to leave. So with the retirements on top of the budget cuts and no classes, our force had been shrunk. Some of the things that I think that we excelled in over the years were, when there were problems in different areas that we weren't in charge of, whether it was like school safety. Those people used to be under the Department of Education, but it was not effective. So, many years ago, they said, well, let the police take it over. And then, with the Department of Homeless Services, it wasn't effectively, able to control some of the shelters that we had and some of the outreach. So they said, well, let's give that to the police department. So we started taking on all these other responsibilities that were not necessarily our responsibility. So we started to even thin out the officers we had for patrol to these other areas. With the budget cuts, we're pulling back from that. In fact, they're going to restructure a lot of that and try and have us focus on essential policing, community relations. I know that Sutapa talked about the cyber related crimes, and there's so much in cyber. I mean, there could be another whole symposium just on cyber, because we're talking about cyber, and we're talking about looking for people radicalized online. And then we're looking for people that are committing crimes online. And then, we haven't even discussed, but, we're very much aware of it here, is our defense mechanisms to either nation state actors or even, just criminals with ransomware. I know that the UK was hit very hard with their medical systems and their hospitals not that long ago. And we're seeing that all the time here, massive ransomware attacks, both in public sector, private companies, but also in public, police departments all throughout the country. So that's really becoming a big problem for us. And one other thing I will throw out, and I think, I don't know, Roy, if you look at it, I'm sure you do in a different way, but with the diversity of the department and people coming in, nation state actors, have exploited trying to get people into police departments, whether it's local police departments, state police departments, or even federal agencies, to try and infiltrate us on the counterintelligence front. And recently, we worked very closely with the FBI and arrested a officer that was working for the Chinese government. So this is a threat that's an internal threat, and I know Sutapa mentioned it too when she talked about intellectual property, stealing intellectual property, or even just to infiltrate, local law enforcement so that they can get information on dissidents that may be living in the area. So these are huge issues, and I just wanted to touch on them, but I'm going to go back to what your question is. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in New York City, federal, state, local, And then there's even tribal for the Indian nations that we have. So, it's very difficult to talk to everybody. And there are some federal programs that try and do that, like Homeland Security has some, programs of, intelligence sharing and so on. But one thing that I think that in the NYPD we did, and it's not just, so many things were talked about that I is going through my mind, the global, the global environment we're in with social media, that when there is an incident that takes place in India, it's going to have repercussions here in New York, and you're going to have a large demonstration here, and you have to know what's going on, and what you're going to expect, whether it's somebody trying to do a coup in Turkey, and then I'm going to end up with 5,000 people of Turkish descent at the UN the next day, or you have to be up on global events. So the global network that we built here, trying to reach out to all these other departments is so important for information sharing in real time. But locally, we've grown also a program called Sentry, and it's something that we started here in the NYPD, but it's to kind of link together nationally all police departments, large police departments. For example, Los Angeles Police Department, they kind of take care of a lot of the smaller departments in Los Angeles, but everything gets fed into a central location in the NYPD called the Sentry program. So we have about 600 agencies throughout the whole entire country that we share information with, and we do documents and we send it out to them, and then when there's an incident in their location, they're going to send the information to us, and we're going to blast it out to the other people. So it's a way of of sharing real-time intelligence, real-time events, incident reports of what's happening throughout the country. And then it's a way of Columbus, Ohio saying, hey, can you put us together with this small department in Georgia, and us putting them together, and then we step back and they can work it out. So this is kind of an informal program that we've developed here that I think is how we connect with not 18,000 agencies, that would be impossible, but with a lot of the major cities, and the major cities are actually connecting with their locals.
So can I ask you a question on that while I remember it, because it's, as you said, so many points. I mean, we could do one of these a week for the next 3 months.
Yeah.
But I mean, what was learned from 9/11, for example, was it doesn't matter how much information you have in the system if you can't process it.
That is true.
So because otherwise, by nature, you're missing stuff. Also, I'll ask you also that point. Sort of, because again, resource deployment, just the management of all of those messages with all of those people. The second thing, as an outsider, and I don't want to speak to the chief of intelligence of New York Police Department to mention NCIS, but that's what most of us think about. And for anybody who's an observer of American culture through films and TV, one of the things that comes across for fans of police programs is the seeming lack of, the seeming oppositionality between different, the FBI turns up, the New York people up, these turn up, those turn up, and they really don't like each other, and it's really an outstanding feature when you look at American sort of culture through those eyes. I mean, is that the reality? I mean, are you, or is it just sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, or is it just part of the TV programs we watch?
Well, I do think that, historically there's been some, issues between different agencies. But I think what's happened, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about New York here. We've been attacked so many times here, over the years, some of them large scale like 9/11, but, we've had a lot of other attacks that have happened here in the last 19 years now, and we have to work very, very closely with our federal counterparts, and we are. And, being that we're all standing there, when, 20 people were mowed down on the West Side Highway, and I'm standing there with my counterpart from the FBI and the ATF saying, what can we do to help? And the DEA and everybody trying to help. And we all know each other. We've developed a community here where there's no time to fight. We divvy up what the responsibilities are. Everybody go out, get back together, and let's work on it. Now, I will say that probably in different parts of the country, they might not have such a great relationship, because remember, we're a large city, so we have a lot of resources from the federal agencies, and we're together all the time. When you're in rural areas, like, for example, there's the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We put 125 detectives on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. In some suburban areas, they may not have anybody on their task force. And that's a problem in sharing information, what you said. 9/11, there was a lot of information, but it wasn't shared between agencies. And sometimes, and this is my personal opinion, so I'm not speaking for the NYPD or the federal government, I think we overclassify things and don't get it out to the people that need to know. That's something that here in New York, we're really, really aware of. And, we're constantly working very closely with the FBI and the JTTF so that everybody knows what's going on. We get most of the people, our executives here, all cleared so that they can get the information that they need to effectively police.
Thomas, again, Roy, can I just check before you go? Roy, do you have to go? I mean, because I know that you're under pressure. Do you have time to stay with us, Roy, or are you looking at your watch and getting ready?
No, I can definitely stay for a little bit more. I mean, I may, if I could just come in a couple of points that Thomas made, if I may, because I think it's really fascinating. So just firstly on the kind of overclassification of information. One of the unintended benefits that COVID has brought us is that we've forced, overnight the Met Police to work in different ways. People are working remotely, we're using kind of video conferencing, and actually that's really prompted people to consider whether things need to be classified at what level. So we're sharing more. And I think, we should dare to share is the phrase. Actually, no one ever, post-event, no one said, oh my goodness, we shared too much information. The criticism is always the other way. It's interesting, you talk about 9/11, Thomas. I'm reading a book at the moment by Matthew Saeed called Rebel Ideas. And it talks about some of the challenges with the US intelligence community and some of the information that was available. Now, whatever your take on the book, it comes back to that it talks about a thing called perspective blindness. And we were talking about the diversity of our workforce being representative of the communities we serve. Actually, sometimes it's about recruiting people who have a perspective which can give context to the information or intelligence you possess, rather than just having it in isolation. And then the other thing, the other point I wanted to come back in on vehemently disagreeing rather, is the kind of the insider threat piece. Insider threat is a massive strategic risk for law enforcement, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. Thomas, you will have seen some of the national media coverage. We recently in the Met arrested a serving police officer with some far right extremist ideas and propaganda. So actually the counter-corruption strategy, the insider threat strategy, not just from a CT, a counter-terrorism perspective, but also from organized criminality. We are a highly valuable target, for people to kind of get in now and seek to exploit and infiltrate later. We are a highly prized target. And actually, as we work more remotely, we embrace video conferencing, remote working. One of the downsides of selling all of your estate is that we have people now that are working remotely. They're working remotely with significant sort of pieces of information. The risk of even inadvertent data leakage and information security is going to get bigger, not smaller, in my view. So same challenges across the pond here.
Thank you, Roy. I'm going to bring in Sutapa because, of course, one of the advantages that America has and UK has is everybody speaks the same language, more or less. Okay, more or less. So I have been in places both in the UK and the States, so I haven't understood a single word anybody said to me. But that's the case. However, of course, in India we don't have that case. I mean, India, though, of course, the Indian Police Service is an English-speaking agency, as is many of the national agencies. But I mean, you also have incredible pressures, don't you? You have, sector pressures. You have ethnic pressures, etc., etc. Some of which, are to a certain extent government-driven. What pressures do you have there to differentiate policing from the external pressures that are sometimes brought upon you to target one or other aspects of the community? Sutapa.
Talk about language. We have a lot of language issues, right? Because there are language differences between North and South and East and West of India. And as leaders of the force, that is the IPS officers, when you get posted to a particular state, you have to know the local language, the regional language, otherwise you just can't function. So English may be connecting the officers and many others in the society, but then you have to know the local or regional stuff. So now talking about pressures, right? That's what you wanted to know. What pressures do the officers face? Well, they can be political pressures, right? And even and behind political pressures, there may be tiny lobbies, there may be religious lobbies, there may be agrarian lobbies, there may be industrialist lobbies. So I think it's more or less the same as the rest of the world faces. It may take different shapes, it may wear masks and come in front of the officer, but I think the pressures are very, very much there because, you know, everybody wants that the police is in their hold. They want to operate through the police and get whatever they want to get done. But then on the other side, you have the rule of law. No matter what, you know, and you talk of corruption. Yes, that is also there. And corruption is just not financial corruption. It's intellectual corruption also. Like, you know, you can carry a lot of biases. Like in our country, we have so many religions, we have so many castes, we have so many tribes, we have so much of variety, you know, so much of diversity. So it can be intellectual. You may have a bias towards a particular community. Now that is going to shape your responses, your actions once you're on the field. So all those things officers have to guard against. They may come into play, but you know, sticking to the rule of law is, I think, is the ultimate source of strength for an officer. No matter what happens around you, if you are sticking to the rule of law, you will be saved, right? Now, I would like to go back to where I left because that would also answer a little bit of your questions because, you know, I feel seeing all the challenges that are coming up for the police, especially in developing nations, we have to reimagine what we have been thinking about policing. Somewhere we have to reinvent, somewhere we have to do a little bit of design thinking. We have to bring in these elements now. You cannot do the traditional, very, very traditional format of policing because the demand, the need is different at this point of time. So what I can tell you is, if I could divide, you know, the solutions, which policing needs at this point of time into quantitative policing and then qualitative policing. So now what do I mean by quantitative policing? It largely means the use of technology. So while their advancements are being made in the kind of technology that is being used by the police, say, you know, adopting the GPS systems in the and trackers in the police patrol cars, geofencing, body cameras, the use of state-of-the-art technology for command and control centers. While you are doing all those things, say for investigation, more forensic science labs, more mobile forensic science labs, right? Mobile police stations, because I told you one very big issue in this country is going to a police station and getting the first information report registered. Registration of FIRs is a big issue, and more so for the vulnerable communities. Obviously, you'll understand why. So while we are doing these things, while we are upgrading our tech level in our responses, we must also think about the qualitative improvements. Now, a lot of upgradation has been done in India in policing over the period of time. We have this CCTNS system, that's the integrated, you know, crime and criminal tracking network, which links up the 15,000 police stations we have across the country and the offices of the supervisory officers. It's a centralized database which can be used, which can be shared, and it also has citizen portals in it, so that, and links up all the other state citizen portals. So there can be an integrated approach. So while we are doing all these mega city policing plans, while we are playing them out, we also need to do a little bit, rather a whole bit of qualitative policing. Now, what do I mean by qualitative policing? There are a couple of things which we need to do in policing and in qualitative policing. And the most important thing is the kind of leadership, right? I spoke about it before also. We need empathetic leaders. We need compassionate leaders. We also need to do community policing, engagement with the community. And that is where you said, you had talked about the private sector. That's an area where the private sector can come in a big way, you know, and help us. We need to do careful predictive policing, because I know there are a lot of critics of predictive policing. But if you are careful enough when the data is being uploaded, I think the algorithms will also work. But if there is data bias initially, then there will be bias when the thing plays out. So we can do very careful predictive policing also. And then we need a robust, you know, setup of engaging the community. See, in developing nations, right? And if I talk of India, there is a huge trust deficit between the citizens and police. That exists. And that acts as a big hindrance, and that needs to be bridged. I think it would be there in some measure in the UK also and in the US also, but it's of great importance in our country. So how do we go about it? You know, we have to customize our policing for the needs of the people, and for we can bring in the other stakeholders like the private sector with their CSR, that they can be a good source of resource, like, because there is resource constraint no matter what police or what over the across the world. And I would just like to give a couple of examples just to, you know, set the ball rolling. So when I was looking after the women and child related issues, you know, I designed a program of community policing based on the 3P module, that is public-private participation module. It was gender sensitive and child-friendly policing. So I designed 9 programs. One of them was a tech platform which enabled anyone, women, any woman, even in rural, remote rural areas, if there was internet facility. And believe me, there is a lot of internet services, even in the rural areas in our country. They could log in from anywhere and put up complaints, which would be examined, which wouldn't get lost. There would be accountability. There would be transparency on that digital platform. And a lot of great work was being done through it, a lot of registration of FIRs. I remember 26% of those complaints were converted into FIRs. So there has to be accessibility. Your system has to be accessible to the people for whom you're working. That is the citizenry at large. Then second was training and in-house training of the police person themselves. Gender sensitive training, child-friendly laws, which, you know, over the period of time, and laws have been changing so fast in our country. They are becoming victim-centric, right? They are socially progressive laws, but policing still remains accused-centric. So there needs to be a paradigm shift. So there was another program which was teaching the police personnel about these laws. Then the third was teaching the citizenry about the laws. How many of them know about all these changes which are happening in the legal framework of our respective countries, especially in the rural areas? Another was interacting with children, boys and girls. That is a very, because they are the future citizens. So if the police is in dialogue with children, with school children, I think it's a great infrastructure which we are building up for trust between the two organizations and for the future. And similarly, there was a program which taught self-defense to the girls in schools, and one very important program which looked towards harnessing the leadership qualities of women, especially in the rural areas. Believe me, I went to one of the areas because I was also working on human trafficking on the Indo-Nepal border. It was the last village of India and the last village from Nepal side. And the women told me the way they were tackling the traffickers. And we have friendly treaties with Nepal. So it's a no man's land, and they keep, there is a lot of, communication and crossing over from both sides, and that leads to a lot of human trafficking. Similarly, there were a couple of other programs within this big community policing program. Apart from this, we also need better collection and better sharing of intelligence, both tactical as well as strategic. And then collection of accurate data. That is something which we still lack. That needs to be improved. And, it has to be a fair mix of both qualitative and quantitative policing. And then last, but not the least, we need to introduce self-care, the notion of self-care in policing now. What happens is a police person is so busy with his or her work, official work, that they forget to look after themselves. And we have seen the results during these COVID times. We've lost so much. We have lost so many people, who had been working day in and day out. So these are certain things which we need to do now. It's very important.
Sutapa, wow. I mean, I could build a 3-year university course out of the last 15 minutes, seriously. I mean, unbelievable. I mean, because the thing about it is, what you've just brought is you've just brought the thing which is missing between, and this is part of what we do, but and I'm sure Thomas will tell you, and Roy will say, you have policing and you have that intuitive capabilities, individual experience-based skills. But if you want to create sustainable organizational capability and development, and of course, Roy, you are heading continuous improvement command, you need two things. You need structure and you need methodology. It's not enough to say, well, this is a 30-year veteran, tell us a few stories. You need structure and you need methodology. And I think you've brought both. So, I mean, that is what we are going to do, by the way. We are going to write up this and put this out, as we've now started a program, as an e-book. We're going to basically collate this conversation and make it available.
Hey, David, there's a point there, I think, that Sutapa made, and I just wrote down, and that's kind of the cumulative impact of trauma. And actually, I don't think we've necessarily got as good as we might do at joining the dots between trauma experienced by police officers and how that relates to citizens. So we have an operation here in the Met called Operation Hampshire. We can't take credit for it. It started down in Hampshire, but it looks at assaults on police officers, and not just physical assaults, but also hate crime against serving police officers. And we're just about to take that to another level, which looks at the cumulative impact of trauma on law enforcement officers and how that flavors interactions that they then go on to have with citizens. So by that, I mean, if you have an officer who has over a 7-day shift cycle, been to 3 homicides, 2 shootings, to some horrific sexual offences, has had a number of incidents where violence has been used against her or him as an officer, how's that impacting the way that they feel and their emotional and physical well-being? And how does that translate into the service that we're delivering to communities of London? Because, I guess developing that point further, are there some places in London, are there some roles, are there some operational environments where your constant exposure to conflict starts flavoring how you police those communities? And, I have to say, I spent 3 years at Brixton, and there are many challenging places in London, but certainly officers there on frontline, what we would call patrol teams or response teams, who are dealing with levels of criticality that colleagues elsewhere might not face for months and months every single day. At what point do we as leaders in our respective organizations have to step in and say, no, actually, we need to look after you now. We need to take you out of that environment. We need to allow you some time to decompress, to process and manage that trauma. Tragically, I've had to deal with 2 recent officer suicides, and we talk about mental health and the importance that has in terms of the communities that we serve. So if you said to all 3 of us, what's one of the challenges facing law enforcement, we'd say, well, mental health. A number of offenders that we come into contact with are suffering from some form of mental health issue. and we're not best placed to deal with that. Well, that's true. That's for offenders. But what about our own people? You know, statistically, police officers and those involved in law enforcement are going to deal with more traumatic incidents than almost any other profession. And when are we going to start really thinking about the impact that has on their ability to deliver, you know, services to our citizens?
Well, I think it's a great point. And then, of course, to tie that into what Thomas is saying, what you said, and then you accept the fact that in a couple of years' time, did you say that 50% of the serving officers would have less than 2 years' experience?
So 50% on our frontline response teams
would have less than 2 years' experience. So they have not built up their own coping mechanisms. Then you take Thomas's point that you have 4,000 officers leaving, which of course, all it does, it heaps extra pressure on the pressures that left, and you can very quickly get into a pretty evil circle, you know, and and especially when you feel you're unloved, you know, and you're unloved both by the population that's serving, but also by the government, you know, that is supposed to be supporting you, and sometimes that feeling of institutional alienation can be very demoralizing.
And the feeling of,
sorry, please, Roy.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but you know, that just to develop that feeling of being unloved a little further, we all spoke about the challenges of policing Black communities at the moment, and how, you know, some sections of the Black community feel over policed and that we disproportionately target them. Take for a moment then, you know, the perspective of a Black police officer. So I spent quite a lot of time recently after some of the Black Lives Matter protests in London, talking to some of our Black colleagues. And they are really facing some challenges at the moment because they feel perhaps unloved by the organisation in the way that they should be. There is certainly things that we need to improve in terms of disproportionality internally. But the abuse that some of those officers then get from members of the Black community themselves, you know, I take my hat off to them because they are doing a difficult job. They are stepping up and stepping forward to be counted, to do something different. They are policing, you know, in this case, some of the BLM protests, and they're doing so with impartiality and fairness. And they are getting abused by members of their own community. So, you know, that feeling of that concept of feeling unloved, you know, I think we really have to be honest and think about how that's particularly impacting some sections of our workforce. And at the moment, I think it's predominantly the black parts of our workforce.
If I could jump in just for a second, you know, with the protests that we're seeing here, you know, that is definitely a factor. We do see that, you know, the protesters signal out the Black officers even more than the white officers. But regardless if they're white or they're Black, one thing that, you know, as leaders out there in the protests, you know, the ability to pull people off of that line because of the fact that they're being abused for so long. And what ends up happening at some point, they just can't take it anymore. And they're going to say something stupid, or they're going to do something to react to, you know, the, you know, antagonistic things that are being done to them. So, you know, you have to rotate them out on a regular basis. But, you know, I want to go back to what Sutapa said about mental health in policing. Last year, we had 10 suicides in the NYPD, which is a lot. And it's been a problem throughout this country with police-related suicides. And mental health has become a real issue for us here in the NYPD. We've started a whole unit just to examine different ways of dealing with mental health. And the problem with the police and mental health is that if you are having problems and you indicate that you're having problems, they'll remove your weapon from you so you're not a threat to yourself, but that also is a stigma. So we have to actually figure out ways to do these things in another manner so that, you know, you're not, you know, standing out as a person that's having some issues. We have some peer-to-peer counseling. We have different programs where we can let people go see private doctors, not doctors associated with the department. So they're getting the help that they need, hopefully. And, you know, we have to make that call. If that person really is in danger, we're going to have to remove that weapon and put them in a place. But we try and do it in a way that everybody doesn't know about it. But mental health throughout this country for police officers, and you're so right. I mean, the things that police officers see, you know, we talked about young officers, and we have a lot of young officers, but I will say that, you know, last year, out of those 10 officers, and many officers who have retired actually last year, so that number would be higher, but they're no longer on the department, they're retired, that have committed suicide. It's older officers that we see more than the younger officers. You know, there was a 40-year veteran chief who retired a day before he retired, took his own life. So, you know, the trauma builds up over a period of time. And you know, I do think that young officers are definitely vulnerable, but I do see it that this is something that builds up over time, and it's the least expected person. And when you hear about it, you're like, I didn't see that coming. So there's a lot of issues with police officers, and you know, having officers, you know, armed, you know, it's so easy for them to go from just having that thought to committing the act. So it's definitely a problem here in the States, and we have to spend more time addressing the mental health issue.